The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to AWCI's webinar, Supply Chain Delays and Rising Cost of Materials. The foundation of the wall and ceiling industry is today's sponsor of our webinar about the economy, and I am Anne-Marie Salvatelli, AWCI's Director of Education. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping items. All attendees should be on mute during today's presentation. Should you have a question at any time during the broadcast, please submit it using the question box in your GoToWebinar dashboard. We will have a Q&A at the end of our presentation and make every attempt to answer all the questions. If you have an audio or visual issues during the presentation today, please do not hesitate to use the question or chat function in your dashboard, and we'll attempt to resolve any issues. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Kermit Baker. Kermit is the Chief Economist for the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, he analyzes business and construction trends for the U.S. economy and examines their impact on AIA members and the architectural profession. Kermit has also served as the project director of the Remodeling Futures program at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University from 1995 to 2021. Kermit received his master's degree in urban planning from Harvard University and holds a PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the same field. And in 2002, Kermit was made honorary member of the American Institute of Architects. So after that, welcome Kermit and welcome all of our attendees. And we'll just get this presentation started. And Kermit, I'll turn it over to you, please.
Well, thanks, Anne-Marie, and welcome to all of our listeners here today, and good to be with you. As Anne-Marie mentioned, in my work with the American Institute of Architects, I do track construction trends as well as what architects can tell us about future levels of construction activity. So I want to focus on those issues. I've got a lot of material I'm hoping to cover this afternoon. Let me jump right in and make sure that we do have time for questions and discussions after I present my material today. Let's see if we can advance here.
Okay.
There we go. There we go, Anne-Marie. Let me see if I can go on to the next one here. There we go. So I'm going to cover four broad topics in my comments this afternoon. The first is the general good news that we're seeing in the broader economy. The second is some emerging issues that present concerns to future economic growth. The third is the positive signs that we're seeing in design activity at architecture firms and what that might mean and suggest for the outlook for construction activity moving forward. And then finally, the overall outlook for the construction sector for the remainder of this year and into 2021. So it turns out that a lot of the key concerns for the economy from last year have totally flipped around, have totally reversed as we moved into 2021. So let me run through some of those. First is vaccination. We seem to have a supply problem last year. This year it's morphed over into a demand problem. Another one is deflation and prices have been a concern in recent years. Now it's very much inflation. Households built up a lot of savings last year. This year, many households plan to go on a spending spree. Working remotely is now being rethought as many businesses look to reopen their office space. Last year, we had steep layoffs in the services sector. Now many businesses are having trouble finding workers. Last year, the question was the stock market overheated? This year, The question is whether the housing market is overheated. And last year we had supply chain issues, and this year we have supply chain issues. So it turns out not everything changes as we flip over the calendar. So let's start with a broader, a look at the broader economy by looking at GDP trends here. And last week we got the first estimate of economic growth for the second quarter of this year for the U.S., and it was another strong reading, with the economy now fully recovered from last year's downturn. The level of activity in our economy finally pushed through the level that we saw before the pandemic. So after, as you can see, a steep decline in the second quarter last year, we had a strong rebound in the third quarter, and now we've had solid growth for 3 subsequent quarters. And the recent jobs report have also been positive, although not quite as strong as the GDP numbers. So we lost over 22 million payroll jobs as the pandemic hit in March and April of 2020, and a mostly healthy month since May of 2020. However, at present, we still have almost 7 million fewer payroll positions than when the pandemic hit. And the national unemployment rate has been steadily improving since it spiked when the pandemic hit. Currently, it stands, as you can see, at just under 6% nationally, which is still well above where it was in February 2020, which was at 3.5%. So that brings us to our first point of confusion here in terms of sorting out the economic tea leaves. If we have fewer people working and a higher unemployment rate, why are so many businesses having trouble finding workers? And we're seeing that worker shortage really permeate throughout the entire economy. A few theories as to what might be going on here, and let me run through some of these with you. The first is that some workers make more by collecting unemployment benefits than by working. It turns out, though, that those states that have declined federal supplemental payments are still having problems finding workers. So clearly, this is not a complete answer to the worker shortage that we're seeing. Secondly, another theory is that people that moved during the pandemic to what they considered to be safer areas are often not in the areas looking for workers at present. So there's a mismatch between where the workers are and where the jobs are. Some workers still have child care obligations or other family care requirements they need to attend to. Some are still nervous about returning to work. And some workers decided to leave the workforce when the pandemic hit, and therefore aren't looking at open employment opportunities. So with that background, let's move on to those issues that should promote more continued strong economic growth. One of the factors that look to keep the economy growing at a very healthy pace. And I'm going to run through 3 here. The first is the infrastructure bill that may provide a stimulus for the construction industry. The second is the large increase in savings by households that didn't see much of a fall off in income during the pandemic, but had fewer opportunities to spend that money. And the third is the need to retrofit many buildings to accommodate the post-pandemic concerns of workers and clients. I'm going to run through a couple of those issues in a bit more detail. And let's start with the infrastructure program. Getting a little bit of background noise, Anne-Marie. There we go. So let's start with the infrastructure program that currently is working its way through Congress. The details are still being worked out, but it looks like it could add almost $550 billion to spending on public works projects over the coming decade, on top of the money for programs that have been authorized and are up for renewal. As I mentioned, most of the funding in this program in its current version is for traditional infrastructure. So these are generally projects that have modest involvement by most building contractors. And it also might put further pressure on materials and labor. So I think, I think the infrastructure package is a bit of a mixed blessing for the traditional buildings market. And let me switch gears a little bit and look at how the pandemic has affected construction in different metro areas across the country. Let me see if I can advance here. There we go. There we go. So this information is from Dodge Data and Analytics. They recently issued a report on construction starts in the 20 largest metro areas across the country. So they looked at activity for the first 6 months of 2020 for these metro areas compared to the same period in 2019. Those are the purple bars. And then again for the first 6 months of 2021 compared to 2020. Those are the blue bars. So I mentioned that they provide this information for the top 20 metro areas in the country. I didn't have space to include all of them. So what I'm showing here are the 9 metros that had the steepest declines in 2020, and well as the 4 that saw, the only 4 that saw increases in non-residential and multifamily construction activity in 2020. So I'm looking at the extremes here, kind of the 9 that did the worst in 2020 and the 4 that did the best. And you see a bit of a pattern here, and I think it's a bit surprising that the metros that saw steep declines in 2020, those 9 on the left, have almost uniformly seen growth in 2021. DC, Washington, DC being the only exception with a modest decline so far in the first 6 months of 2021. Whereas the 4 that saw growth during the pandemic are almost uniformly seeing declines in 2021, Dallas being the only exception to that. So basically what we're seeing is a switching. If you did well last year, you're probably not doing that well this year. If you did poorly last year, you're probably doing pretty well this year. So a way of evening out construction activity that we're seeing as we move through the pandemic. Another topic I mentioned was retrofitting existing facilities. And again, having trouble advancing here. There we go. Well, we're not getting all of this slide, but I can talk through it a little bit. There have been several reports about the needed retrofits to existing buildings, given how space is likely to be utilized post-pandemic. So this past June, we asked architecture firms how their project work on existing facilities had changed since the pandemic hit. And almost a third of firms, you can't see all the labels, but on the red one there, work on existing facilities increased a lot. That was 8%. The black pie is increased, work on existing facilities increased a little. So over a third of firms said that work on existing facilities has increased so far in 2021. The big slice, 56%, say that work remained the same. And then we had the yellow slice that work declined a little, and that blue slice, 4%, that said work declined a lot. So, you know, in summary, a third of firms indicated that their share of work on existing buildings had increased with the pandemic. Well, most of the rest indicated that this share essentially remained unchanged. So we are seeing at least architecture firms report that they're seeing greater portions of their workload focused on retrofitting existing facilities rather than designing new ones. But that does vary a little bit depending on the sector you're working in. So we did ask the firms that worked in each of these building sectors to report whether the share of work on existing facilities was increasing, decreasing, or remaining the same. And what the numbers here are the share that said it was increasing minus the share that said it was decreasing. So sort of the net increase for those on the left and the net decrease for those on the right. And what's the pattern in terms of these sectors? So sectors seeing the most net increase were, as you can see, number one there, manufacturing and distribution, probably not too much of a surprise since all the work on e-commerce that we've seen during the pandemic. Secondly, multifamily, a reasonably hot sector, so not too surprising that there's improvements going on there. But then we see most of the institutional sectors that are seeing not as great, but at least some positive growth in terms of work on existing facilities. And the declines were heavily concentrated in the commercial sector. So it looks like the commercial buildings are lagging a little bit more in terms of work being done to prepare those for a post-pandemic market. And it's the manufacturing, the residential, as well as most of the institutional are getting a leg up on that. Let me move to the next. The first set was upsides to the outlook for the economy. There's also a growing list of issues that may slow economic growth in the coming quarters. So let me run through some of these. The first is sort of, as we suggested, inflation that may push up interest rates, and I think that's why there's a concern on that front. The second is particular problems with the cost and availability of construction materials that seem to be caused by supply chain issues, so very central to what we've been talking about. Third, as I sort of hinted at before, concerns over rising house prices. Fourth is emerging issues regarding labor availability. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And then finally, ongoing issues regarding managing the pandemic with the new variants. And I won't talk much about that. I think that's pretty obvious that that's a mounting concern. Let's start with inflation. We can see the overall pace of inflation in both the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as well as the PPI, the Producer Price Index. So the CPI, that's the red line here, that measures prices that consumers pay. It's been running in the sort of the 2% range for recent years. It dropped a little bit as the pandemic hit, but then began accelerating earlier this year, and currently consumer inflation is growing at an almost 5% pace, as you can see there with the most recent numbers. Producer prices, the black line, wholesale prices are generally a bit more volatile. So they fell negative as the pandemic hit, but also began skyrocketing earlier this year and are growing at close to 7% with the most recent numbers that we're seeing. And while we're seeing inflation, throughout the economy, we're seeing particular issues in the price and availability of particular construction commodities and products. So we've seen more than a 25% increase in construction inputs over the last year. That's the blue bar on the left there. And that's particularly surprising given the overall weakness that we're seeing in the construction market. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes too, but it's been very weak so far this year on the non-residential side. However, the largest jumps have come from a few key commodities. You can see those red bars on the right, lumber, metals, energy I don't have directly on there, but we've seen spikes in energy costs too. Now the middle, more on the services side there, construction wages, for example, rose 3% over the past year. Now that's certainly higher than normal, but I think not yet in the cause for alarm. And commodity prices historically are more volatile, but generally wages are the key to the long-term outlook for inflation because they get locked in for an extended period of time. Once you negotiate increases in wage contracts and things like that, you can be assured that inflation is going to be with you for a while. While on the commodity side, they tend to be a little more volatile. So what can we expect in terms of future rates of inflation, particularly for those that we're interested in, the volatile construction commodities and projects and products? Well, there's a saying in the commodities market that the cure for high prices is, in fact, high prices. And the theory is that high prices encourage buyers to look elsewhere and encourages producers to increase production, kind of standard economics 101. The theory is based on a couple of assumptions, though. The first is that we have a competitive market. No major monopolies in terms of supplying these goods or services, and I think that's generally a fair assumption. We don't seem to have many monopolies in this marketplace. We tend to have a pretty competitive marketplace. But the second assumption is that producers are able to increase production, and that's certainly been a problem with the pandemic because we've seen a lot of instances where actually manufacturers are unable to increase production. And some of that, in fact, a lot of that seems to relate to the trend towards globalization that we've seen in recent decades. We've seen a much more complicated web of of suppliers for products and much more interdependence on how that supply chain works. And you just need one link in that chain to break down for the whole system to kind of freeze up. And I think that's increasingly what we've seen during the pandemic. Well, the buildings market is generally quite soft, as I mentioned. The housing market's been red hot recently, so we're seeing house price increases at a double-digit pace annually in recent months, and we're seeing home building activity pick up as a result of that. So we had just about 1.3 million housing starts nationally in 2019. We had almost 1.4 million last year. We're on a pace to have about 1.6 million housing starts this year. And these are very healthy numbers, healthy growth. But when we put it in historical perspective, we're seeing fairly typical levels of production now. So, for example, looking at the 1980s, we averaged about 1.5 million starts a year. Average year in the 1980s was about 1.5 million starts. In the 1990s, it dipped just a little bit to almost 1.4 million starts a year on average, and then jumped back in the 2000s, leading up to the Great Recession, where we had averaged over 1.5 million starts a year for that decade too. However, this past decade, 2010 to 2019, we didn't even average 1 million starts a year. So we have a fairly significant deficit in housing, which is one reason that prices are rising so fast. We just have a tremendous need that hasn't been, we haven't caught up with yet. Let me move on to labor. It turns out that construction is not a terribly attractive career path for many younger workers entering the labor force. So the National Association of Home Builders did a survey a little over 4 years ago now, where they asked 18 to 25-year-olds what career path they were pursuing, or if they weren't yet in a career path, what career path they hope to pursue. So as you can see, many selected healthcare, business, technology, even the STEM fields as career paths they want to pursue. Construction didn't attract much interest. Only 3% of respondents indicated an interest in a career in construction. Construction has typically accounted for 6% to 7% of all payrolls nationally. So we're not generating enough interest among younger workers to even maintain current employment levels. We're well below what we need to do just to kind of hold on to current levels of employment in the industry. And for that reason, labor is becoming a big issue for construction. And part of that is because the construction labor force is in many ways different from the overall labor force. So this series of graphs here, and I'll walk you through this, looks at the composition of the construction workforce. Those are the red bars with the percentage for each characteristic at different years, compared to the broader national labor force. And those are the black dots that we're seeing, again, with the percentage of the national labor force that is in each of these characteristics. So let me just highlight a few takeaways from this graphic. One is that construction is much more reliant on immigrant workers than other industries. So as you can see in the 2019 data there, 29% of construction workers are foreign-born, compared to 17% of the U.S. labor force. So turns out construction is second only to agriculture in terms of its reliance on foreign-born workers. Secondly, construction continues, particularly the construction trades, continues to have difficulties attracting women. Over the past 2 decades, the share of women in the industry, as you can see, has inched up only very modestly. Third, construction continues to have difficulties attracting college-educated workers. And finally, the construction workforce is getting older. There's a smaller share of younger workers, while the share of workers age 55 and older has almost doubled since 2002. Not a typical pattern. Construction is typically an occupation of younger workers. And we're also seeing a regional pattern to this too. Attracting immigrants is, as I mentioned, critical to maintaining the workforce. It doesn't appear that a major immigration overhaul is in the works, at least in the near term. As I mentioned, nationally, about 29% of construction workers are foreign-born. Some of the most heavily populated states, Florida, New York, Texas, California, have an even heavier reliance on immigrant workers to fill construction jobs. Some of the larger states, some of the states that have a disproportionate share of construction activity too, so that's creating problems. One potential for solving the construction problem, a potential silver lining from the emerging labor shortage, is that we may see more widespread adoption of labor-saving technologies in the industry. So NAIOP, a commercial real estate association, put out a report this spring that looked at emerging construction technologies. Some of these are fairly established. Some of them are on the horizon. So let me start with the established technologies that they profile. First being modular construction, second off-site construction, third GPS technologies for physical analysis, fourth wearable technologies, and fifth BIM for digital plans, building information modeling. Those are fairly well in place. They haven't been adopted at terribly high levels, but I think at least the industry is fairly well aware of these technologies. We do have some emerging technologies that offer future potential. Let me run through a few that this NAIOP report summarizes. The first is 3D printing. The second is mass timber. The third is construction robotics. Fourth is autonomous vehicles. The fifth is drones, and the final one is augmented and virtual reality. So again, very much in their early stages in terms of applications to the construction process. Let me move on to our architecture billings index and some of the information we're getting from architecture firms about the outlook for construction activity. So our architecture billings index is derived from a monthly survey of architecture firms, where we ask them how their revenue for the past month compares to the prior month. So this is sort of a month-to-month change in billings, a month-to-month change in revenue. Now, the results from this survey are rolled up into an index where a score of 50 indicates that billings are stable nationally. A score above 50 indicates that they're growing. A score below 50 indicates that they are declining. Now, we've been running this survey for over 25 years, and we've found that our architecture billings index accurately leads construction activity by 9 to 12 months. So the June reading kept our string of strong readings alive with the fifth straight month positive monthly number from our index, and the numbers we're seeing now indicate the strongest monthly gains at architecture firms since before the 2008 Great Recession. Some really strong bounce back that we're seeing in these numbers. And an additional positive sign is that backlogs at our architecture firms shot up to 6.5 months in the second quarter of this year, matching the high that they were seeing at the peak of the last cycle. So backlogs have increased a full month and a half on average at architecture firms from the pandemic low in the second quarter of last year. Let me run through just a little more detail from our architecture billings index, and first look at this by specialization of the architecture firm. So we look at firms that specialize either in the multifamily residential market, the commercial industrial market, or the institutional market. And these are quarterly numbers, so we can see a trend a little more easily. So multifamily residential saw a modest recovery by the third quarter of last year, but then stalled. However, as you can see, the most recent figures show a renewed strength in the multifamily residential market. Commercial industrial saw surprisingly strong first quarter this year. This was deemed to be the weakest non-residential market overall. The strength accelerated recently in the second quarter, so we're seeing the commercial industrial specialty firms show the strongest growth in billings. And then finally, the institutional firms saw billings level off in the first quarter, where we saw scores of exactly 50 in the first quarter of this year, and seeing strength in the second quarter. So we're now seeing strength really across the board in all major sectors of the billings market. We're also seeing strength in all of the major regions across the country. So, the strongest numbers now are coming from firms in the Midwest, but we're also seeing very strong readings from firms in the South and West, and even the Northeast has been the weakest sector recently. We're seeing some pretty healthy numbers with the most recent figures. So let me end up my presentation by talking about the outlook for design and construction. And let me begin by kind of an assessment of where we are in terms of construction spending activity through the first half of this year. So these are monthly numbers from the U.S. Commerce Department that tracks spending on major sectors. What I'm looking at here is, or what you're looking at here, are January to June totals in 2021 compared to January to June totals in 2020. Now, we saw construction spending for buildings for this category decline about 2% in 2020. We're seeing this decline accelerating as we're moving through 2021, and with half of the year in, we're now seeing declines of almost 10% on average overall. And as you can see, that those the sectors that are showing declines are across the board. Every major sector that we track is seeing at least some declines through the first half of the year, and just about equal between activity on the commercial industrial side, sort of the private side of the market, as opposed to the institutional, the sort of the nonprofit or public side. Both of them seeing declines as about at about 9.5%, almost 10%. On the institutional side, we're seeing the biggest weakness, number one, in the lodging category. Probably not too many surprises there, but as well, also seeing weakness on office construction. On the institutional side, public safety, amusement and recreation, religious, education also are sectors that we're seeing weakness in. And I think the education one particularly of concern because of the size of that market. It's the largest institutional market in terms of dollar volume of construction. Now, resiliency is also an issue for construction. We've seen natural disasters become more frequent and more destructive, which is becoming a major source of needed rebuilding and repair activity, particularly in vulnerable areas across the country. So the total damage done by natural disasters, as you can see, does bounce around a lot, but we fit a trend line through that to kind of see where the trend is moving, and it's in general moving from under $25 billion a year a couple decades ago to closer to $100 billion a year now on average. As you can see, a spike of over $300 billion in 2017 with the major hurricanes that year. But the chances are we're going to continue to see an upward trend in terms of damage done by natural disasters. Alternative fuels, another opportunity in the construction industry for systems retrofits, as well as the potential to reduce carbon emissions. Progress continues to be low on this front. This is information from a recently released BP statistical overview where they document that coal, oil, and natural gas still account for 83% of primary energy consumption globally. And just a small share of energy generation is in renewables. It turns out renewables are the fastest growing segment of energy consumption and energy generation, but off of a very small base. So wind accounts for about half of renewables in terms of generation, solar, and also geothermal and biomass about 25% each. So what's the outlook for new facilities in the multifamily residential and commercial market? Well, let me walk you through this table. This is information from the real estate communities or the investment community, and I think they give us a pretty good insight as to what types of facilities are oversupplied and what types of facilities are undersupplied. So they generally look at two major indicators here, one being vacancy rates and the other being rent growth. And that gives us, I think, a pretty good sense of market conditions and projected market conditions. So what I've got here are projections from a group of real estate professionals for the next 2 years, so for the remainder of 2021, and then their projections for 2022 and 2023 through an effort that's compiled twice a year by the Urban Land Institute. So let me walk through some of these sectors in terms of what they see in terms of vacancy changes and vacancy rate changes and rental rate changes for the major multifamily, commercial, and industrial markets here. And let me start with multifamily, and I think their sense is this is still very strong demand here. So vacancy rates, by and large, are below the long-term average that we've seen for this market. The second column there has the 20-year average. So vacancy rates declining, but starting out below that, and rental rates certainly after 2021 look to be above the long-term average. So that certainly indicates health in that market. The outlook for office, retail, and hotel, pretty much the same. It seems like their perception is these markets are oversupplied. Vacancy rates, by and large, are above the long-term averages. Rental growth is below the long-term average. I should point out some of the strange numbers we're seeing in the hotel projections there in terms of that line of RevPAR change, revenue per available room, that they see growing in the strong double-digit rate this year, next year, and in 2023. That's a bit misleading because obviously room rates change pretty dramatically and pretty instantaneously, unlike rents for offices and retail space. And revenue per available room for hotels declined over 50% last year. So those strong numbers are just kind of digging out of a very deep hole. And finally, the industrial market, like the apartment market, fairly strong in terms of what they see in availability rates and rental rate changes. Now, part of that is because some companies are deciding to bring back production domestically because of the problems they've had with global sourcing that we talked about before, as well as the growth in distribution facilities. That warehouse category is in here too, and with the growth in e-commerce, we're seeing an awful lot of activity in terms of the distribution front. So let me wind up with our construction outlook from our semi-annual AIA consensus construction forecast panel. And if I can advance this here to get to that. There we go. We got the first one here. So to develop these forecasts, we survey the leading construction forecasters nationally for their outlook for key building sectors. And these are pretty much hot off the press. These forecasts were released just towards the end of last month. So what I've got here in the red bar in each of these categories is the level of construction spending in 2020. The teal bar, the blue bar, is the projected growth in that category, or in this case, decline this year, and the yellow bar is projected growth for next year. So I mentioned a few times that we saw a 2% decline in construction spending in 2020. Our forecast panel is projecting about a 4% decline this year and a 4.5% rebound next year. Commercial buildings projected to see the steepest declines and the steepest growth next year, but all major categories sort of a similar pattern, sort of a low to mid single-digit decline this year in terms of spending, and then a low mid to single-digit increase in construction spending next year. Let me run through this in a little more detail, though, starting with the commercial side of the market and the major categories that we're seeing there. If you could advance that for me, Anne Marie. Hotels are expected to see the steepest decline this year, but the strongest growth next year as the economy continues to reopen. Offices decline this year and remain office construction spending basically flat next year. Retail, surprisingly, the strongest sector with just a modest decline this year and healthy growth next year. Part of that is because within the retail sector, you also see some distribution facilities. I talked about that being related to manufacturing. Depending on the nature of that distribution facility, it's categorized either as retail or manufacturing. But we see a fair amount of distribution in this retail number. And then on the institutional side of the market, healthcare is expected to bounce back a bit this year and see continued growth next year. Education, talked about before, declined much more through the first half of the year, but our forecast panel is expecting that decline to moderate by the time we get to the end of next year. Now, we care an awful lot about these two categories. Within the institutional market, there's a lot of categories I haven't presented here, but health and education account for about 60% of the total spending in that category. So that really drives what we're seeing here. Amusement and recreation, no surprise, a steep downturn, but a reasonably healthy recovery expected next year. So let me end up by summarizing some of the key opportunities and challenges for the construction industry. And let me start with the opportunity side. When we expect to see overall market activity continue to increase because of growth in the broader economy. And we're seeing some traction in terms of greater focus on sustainability and resiliency in the building stock. And as I discussed, the emerging technologies may offer, offset some of the workforce issues that we're going to deal with. There are going to be more than our share of challenges moving forward. Certainly, growing uncertainty surrounding the economic outlook. Labor is a growing concern. Still, fallout from the pandemic in terms of demand for facilities. I think categories like hospitality, cultural, maybe even offices. Now, are we going to see sort of permanently reduced levels of demand in those categories as a result of changing lifestyles from the pandemic? And then finally, as we talked about, supply chain issues not fully resolved, and this sort of what we think of as short-term inflation may be a little bit longer than we would hope for until we get sort of these global supply chains back working again. So let me leave it there, Anne Marie, and with the remaining time, open it up for some questions and discussion.
Absolutely, thank you, Kermit. So this question that came in is touching on the last bullet point you had about higher material prices. Is the inflation that raised the prices of building materials permanent? And then do you expect the prices to come down anytime soon? Meaning, are we looking, will this ripple effect go through 2023?
Sure, I think that's a great question and a very difficult one to answer, because what's causing these supply chain glitches varies an awful lot from product to product. But I do think we can see the path already. If any of the listeners have been tracking lumber prices, for example, they just shot up starting about a year ago, and they're starting to moderate a little bit. They're still extremely high. 2-3 times as high as they were a year ago, but not 4 times as high as they were a year ago, which we were seeing a couple months ago. So I think we do start to see this sort of supply and demand come back into balance, and that's mostly as we were able to fix up some of the supply chain issues that have caused the problems that we're seeing there in terms of pricing. But I think equally, and I think a lot of listeners would agree, that the availability is big of a problem. I don't know when I can get the product. It may be on 4 to 6 months back order. How does that delay all the current projects I'm working on by pushing back the installation schedule and things like that. So it's caused a myriad of problems. When will this be resolved? We're going to see it piece by piece, product by product, market by market, I think. But I think we'll start to see some easing as we move through the second half, even of this year. When will they be back to normal? I think we're probably at least a year away, and normal, obviously a relative term, as we see more strength on the buildings market, continued strength on the housing market. We're going to see a lot of demand for these products moving forward. So that's also going to slow down the pricing adjustments that we might hope to see.
Thank you. Our next question is the institutional/public construction lagging in part because the municipalities are holding back and waiting for infrastructure bill funding?
Well, the institutional market tends to be later in terms of turning down during an economic downturn, later in terms of recovering. And I don't think it's overly related to waiting for infrastructure funding before they go ahead on that. I think it has a lot to do with their funding sources. Now, state and local government that fund a lot of this infrastructure we were talking about, really got hammered during the pandemic. They saw that their revenue declined pretty significantly. They saw their services they needed to provide increase. So they're in pretty tough shape overall. They got a little bit of money through this federal stimulus funding, but I think not nearly enough to put their budgets back in terms of normal levels. So are they building new schools? Are they building new fire stations and things like that? I think still want to get their fiscal house in order before they move ahead on this. And we're seeing a lot of sort of short-term fixes for this. For schools, don't build a new school, but pull in some modular facilities or something like that to handle the overflow. I think some deferred modernization spending and other sorts of things. So I think this pattern of residential first, commercial second, institutional third is very much typical for how a cycle unfolds, and I think we're seeing pretty much that pattern play out in this cycle also.
Thank you. And this one is keeping with the infrastructure bill, and they're asking about looking for what we know of and hear about this bill. Do you expect the drive landing on the contractors that they need to adopt more technology than what's already out there and really strengthen that investment into technology going forward?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, Anne-Marie, but I do think there's going to be a lot of pressure to adopt more technologies. And I'm not sure I see it resulting from the infrastructure bill per se. I don't know of any requirements on that contractors adopt technologies, if that's what the question is alluding to. But as I said in my remarks, we have an emerging construction labor problem that I think can only get worse moving forward. And if we were to see this infrastructure bill pass, let's say it's a $550 billion package over the next decade or so, that's going to add a significant share to spending in this market. Now, I also said that not much of this is related to homes or even non-residential buildings. Most of it is focused on public works. But to some extent, there's a fluid enough workforce out there in the construction industry that if workers get moved over to these infrastructure projects, there's going to be fewer of them to work on buildings and homes that particularly for some of these specialty subs that may overlap all of these markets. So I think as we see the non-residential building market recover kind of from a normal cyclical level, as I suggest is going to happen next year, if we see this burst of spending for infrastructure additionally, that's going to put even more pressure on the labor market, more pressure on the materials market. There doesn't seem to be an easy way to get those extra workers. Every industry throughout the economy is looking for workers, and we don't see a massive influx of new immigrants to help meet that demand. So I think the strategy is going to be, how can we make our workers work more efficiently? How can we make our workforce more productive? And that will mean, I think, looking at some of those technology issues that I discussed to see if that's a way of helping to offset that problem.
Thank you. In the attendee did say, in talking about the adoption of technology, they were thinking of referring to BIM, rovers, drones, e-construction, etc. So thank you for that.
Exactly.
And then another question that just came in: are design build style projects getting more popular in residential building?
That's a great question. It turns out that design build, I think of as having a designer on staff, as opposed to design bid build, where it moves from an architect to a contractor with a bid in between. So I guess the question is it more common to have design skills in-house for those projects? And I haven't seen any statistics on that, whether it's changed much. I mean, there was a big surge about 10 or 15 years ago as contractors were bringing on designers, because it really streamlined the operation. We don't have to go through that bid process. We don't have designers and contractors that are sort of at loggerheads in terms of working on a project. They're all on the same team, and so it should help that, in terms of keeping on budget and on schedule. But I haven't seen any recent numbers that suggest it's going through another round of growth. So may well be, but I haven't seen any statistics that would support that, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kermit. That is, you have answered all the questions that have come into our poll so far. So on behalf of AWCI, I would like to thank Kermit Baker and all of our attendees in joining us for today's webinar. And thank you to the Foundation of the Wall and Ceiling Industry for sponsoring this webinar. So thank you to all of you, and have a very productive day.
Thanks, Anne Marie, and good to be with you today.
Same here. Bye-bye.